Yesterday, President Trump was asked a pretty interesting question about his view of Biden and his relationship with Bernie Sanders. Let's take a listen.
Well, if you look at the manifesto that they've come up with, and if you look at their stance on religion and things having to do very importantly with aspects of religion and faith, I don't think a man of deep religion would be agreeing to the Bernie Sanders plan. You take a look at what they have in, and you can't put that into the realm of a religious group of people. I will say that.
He went on
sure what he was referring to, actually.
I don't either. And he went on to talk, he went on endlessly about how they're going to triple taxes and they're going to take health care away from 180 million people. None of this, of course, is true. And there's a couple layers here because there's first of all, he said before Biden being elected would hurt God. So it kind of falls into what are you talking about? Second of all, I'm not a Christian scholar, but I seem to recall Jesus talking about the least of these. And there tends to be a complete blind spot for the poverty aspect of Jesus's teachings as well. But then also something we've been talking about this show, the idea that Bernie and Biden have this joint manifesto and are going to be co-presidents this next time around is just completely mind-blowing.
He's just been reading too much. This is what happens. You have the RNC and the Trump campaign. There's a lot of very traditional Republican staffers there. And this is the same stuff that you would hear from, basically these are the base Republican talking points of almost the last 30 years.
Yes.
And on abortion, I think he's probably right. But that's a very typical GOP kind of stance, and I also think that anybody who was voting for Trump on abortion was already with him and was going to stay with him for a long time, right?
100%.
So it's messaging on that particular front doesn't seem like the most effective. Right now, we look at the polling all day long. What is it? Who are the people that you would want to bring back into your coalition who might be more sympathetic to a Joe Biden? Senior voters, okay. White working class voters, you're still winning amongst them, but you need to win some back. And a lot of these suburban voters. So how exactly are you going to do that? If you look at the polling, the number one way would be to talk about the virus. So I think that the way that he should be messaging this is to say, virus certainty and about economic certainty, and not kind of this old baseline, they'll triple your taxes type attack, because I just don't see that working right now. And as I understand it, a lot of voters don't really believe that about Joe Biden. That's one of the things, we've confronted the Trump campaign about this. We're look, even if what you were saying is true, some of it which is not, then voters do not believe that.
Yeah.
You have to, around Hillary, people actually believed she was corrupt. So when you called her corrupt, it was okay, yeah, you're kind of stating not just a truth, but something that people very much feel to be true. People do not feel that way about Joe Biden.
They don't. And this is underscored in a new focus group of voters, some former Trump voters, some Biden voters, some independents that was conducted for NPR. And basically, they don't see Trump's Biden's a leftist who wants to end police and he's a Marxist and he loves Bernie Sanders and his manifesto thing. This just isn't landing whatsoever. They see it as a political trick. And what is the thing that Donald Trump was so known for and what people really responded to with him last time around? The fact that they felt like he was telling it like it is, right? Now, look, you can dispute whether he's really telling it like it is and whether he's been honest and all, but he had this sense of authenticity because he would say things you weren't supposed to say, right? This time around, when you're coming up with these typical looking political ads that are so transparently ridiculous and caricaturish and out of the same RNC playbook that they've been running for 30 years, as you put it, you start to lose some of that sense of authenticity, and you certainly lose touch with what voters' real concerns might actually be about Joe Biden. This stuff is just not landing with them whatsoever.
This is the thing I don't understand. If I were to attack Biden, if anybody sensibly would, what do voters have concerns about Biden? Number one, probably his age. That's something Trump has done, but he hasn't necessarily done it in a way of saying this person cannot be president or this person would not be able to command the facilities of the office. The other one is about corruption and about his record, the things that brought him into office. Did you hear one word in there about trade, about China, about immigration, about any of the things that brought him into office? It's kind of mystifying. It's one of these things where you just can never seem to balance what exactly the core critique of Biden is from Trump and from the Trump campaign and so much more. If I listen to them across cable, I would say their number one critique is that he's Bernie. People don't believe that. because it's not true.
Right.
So it should be instead, he's Biden. Biden himself has a lot of problems. We saw them all throughout the Democratic primary, but they don't want to pick up on that.
Well,
it's very much to their detriment.
Also, by the way, the Bernie agenda's never been more popular than it is right now. I mean, support for Medicare for all is up. So all of those,
Parts of it.
Parts of it, you're right. And I think on the policing aspect, right, that's what they're trying to tie, like, oh, Biden's a radical Marxist and he wants to defund the police, which, of course, the opposite of what he said. But I do want to sound a cautionary note for Democrats, because you have tied yourself to a guy who can't do anything. I mean, he can't campaign. Every time he gives an interview, it's an utter train wreck, utter disaster, right? Can't command the conversation, can't direct the narrative. And so you're completely counting on Trump continuing to fail. Now, so far, he's delivered for you, right? There's a new poll out, though, from yesterday that I really wanted to highlight here, basically to debunk it, because people got very excited. It's a Georgetown University poll that showed in battleground states that Biden was up 13 points. Oh, my goodness, look at this. But it didn't weight by education. And the sample included 63% with a college degree, which is almost exact flip of what the actual electorate would be,
like.
right? It's more 2/3 non-college, 1/3 college educator, the numbers that I've seen. This was, when you talk about the errors that pollsters made last time around, this failing to wait for education was maybe the primary error. I know people talk about the shy Trump voters, whatever. That may be some effect, right? We do still see some difference between live caller polls where you have to actually talk to a human being and tell them that you like Trump versus online polls or virtual polls where you don't have to actually tell a human being. So that could be a real thing. But this education weight turns out to have been the biggest miss in terms of how pollsters were off last time around. And look, I don't want to overstate the case here, because they were pretty close in range on the national poll margin. Hillary did win the national vote, right, the popular vote. They were off by a few points in a few critical states, and that made all the difference. But it's crazy to me that a pollster would continue this time, or well-known, well-respected pollsters would still continue this time around to not weight by college education. So if you see results from that poll, I would heavily discount what they are telling you is going on.
People were doing backflips over it. It's like you said, the education weighting and also likely voter and registered voter screening. And actually, I think Nate Cohn dug into some of the crosstabs, and he's like, because you can actually see the real sampling. And the moment you did, of course, the results dramatically narrowed. No, look, here's what's happening. The election is getting closer. As the election gets closer, the election is getting tighter. Biden's lead in the RCP polling average is about 6.3%, almost exactly the same as Hillary Clinton's was back in 2016 at this exact time during the election. Now, there's a lot of different things that could happen, right? We have the conventions. The convention list was actually just announced. Obama's going to be speaking. Many of these other, Michelle Obama's going to be speaking. Biden, we don't know who's going to pick for vice president. Typically, people get a bump out of a convention. Does that happen whenever, there's no conventions like with real does a Zoom convention lead to a bump? No. So all of the traditional metrics by which we look at polling, by which we look at elections and look at their pacing, they don't apply, right? So same for Trump. I mean, his acceptance speech, he might give it from the White House. He might give it from Gettysburg, he said yesterday. Okay, but again, these are not like theatrical things the way that the conventions are that dominate media attention. So without that, I think everybody's political fate is tied to the virus and how that goes. That's it. And the economy, of course. But those two things, as far as I can tell, the only determinative factors of this election.
And that you're at this place where things are as bad as they are, and the failures of leadership are manifest and abundant, and Trump is still in striking distance. If I were Democrats, I'd be very, very uncomfortable with that, especially because it will not be sustainable for Joe Biden to be as low profile as he has ultimately been. So, all of that is to say, there are so many more wild cards this election cycle than maybe we've ever seen before. I mean, you mentioned several. Obviously, the virus is it. There's news today that Russia claims they have a vaccine. What's going on with that? That's one piece. The economy is another piece. But also just the reality of voting in a pandemic, the altered timeline. In New York, we've seen a disaster where something like 20% of mail-in ballots get tossed out. Who does that benefit? Who does that help? Who does that hinder? How does that all shake out? Nobody knows. There's just no answers to this.
That's right.
So I would just urge a lot of caution. And again, to the poll, make sure that you are doing your due diligence, listening to people who actually understand how these polls should be going, and absolutely throw out any that are not weighting by education, because that was a massive miss last time around.
Very good point.
All right, more Rising for you after this.